Mm. Well, it's a pleasure to welcome all those who are here and all those who are viewing via Zoom for this lecture, which Andrew is about to deliver. The only thing I'd like to say, as by way of an introduction, if I may, is about just a couple of words about the park itself, or at least the survival of the park. And I think it's the Lancastrians we can thank for that. Essentially, I think it was a brother of Henry V. It was Gloucester, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Who walled the park and did us all a very, very big favour. Because without that walling, it is and its use, of course, as a royal park from then on. Without that, I'm sure we'd have lost an awful lot of the ground surfaces within the park, both on high ground and low. And we would not therefore be in a position to find, for example, the Saxon burials or the Roman temple site, and lots of other things as well that were in the park and enclosed by those walls. When I think about what's been lost through all the digging for sand, etc., on Blackheath, with the odd reference to finds, but no real details about them, we've lost an awful lot of that area beyond the Duke of Gloucester's wall. So I think it's not often I stop to thank a royal family, but I think we can thank the Lancastrians for that. And Andrew has done a lot of work, of course, in the park, and he's very kindly come here tonight to tell you all about it. So welcome, Andrew, and good luck. Okay. I'll get out. Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna. Oh, even better. Thanks. No, it's fine. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, then we can have a snooze and I'm not. Hello everyone. We're doing a hybrid, so I've got to stand here and talk towards the laptop and not be too animated and go that way. I have to stand in the front of it. So we're talking today about the archaeology of Greenwich Park and the projects I've been doing in the park since 2021. And we've had a whole range of projects, and this image here on the screen is just one of our projects. This is our long trench, probably I'll say it's the longest community archaeology trench dug in 2023, perhaps, in the park, from the top of the grand ascent to the bottom, with that incredible view. You don't get many better views than that as a backdrop to your digs. Does it go on? That one, or that one, or that one. How do I go on, Jane? No. Press it harder. Okay. For anyone who doesn't know where Greenwich Park is, hopefully you've all been there. But we're talking about the Greenwich Park, which is just south of this the river bend here in of the River Thames. Talking to Matt Pope, this bend in the river is probably a Holocene bend. So this bend has been here for maybe 10,000 years. And then we're looking at the park, which is just to the south of that bend. Trying to get the pointer to work. It's not going to work on me now, but the park, as we said, was enclosed in the 1400s, and so has remained this incredible green space for over 600 years now. And as Harvey was saying, I think the archaeology has been preserved by those actions, which has been fantastic. Better press. That's it. I came to the park as a younger community archaeologist in 2021, having worked mostly on community archaeology projects in Kent since 2009. And then this position came up with the Royal Parks to do the Greenwich Park Reveal project. And so that took off in the sort of spring of 2021 as we were coming out of the various lockdowns and COVID restrictions. And then we started our sort of main volunteer projects in the autumn of that year and have been carrying on. And we'll be carrying on this summer with a further dig in May, hopefully, fingers crossed. But my connections with the park go back much further, because even before I was born, I had a connection with the park, because my dad is somewhere in that line of officers there when the old Royal Naval College was still part of the a naval establishment. And Dad is one of those naval officers waving the Queen up for the Queen's Jubilee in 1977. So long association with Mayfields and the Greenwich area. Greenwich Park revealed as a £12 million investment into the park. And the point of the project was to try and sort of spread the visitor load across the park. What we found at Greenwich Park is that most tourists and visitors tend to go up and down Blackheath Avenue towards the observatory, and then they sort of get stuck along that main thoroughfare. And so Greenwich Park, part of the project was to try and encourage people to use a wider part of the park. So we've added things like the new cafe in the southeast corner. We've got a new learning centre at the south border as well. And then various other facilities and park improvements. So we're trying to spread that visitor load across the park and encourage people to use the wider park as well. And so the investment has covered everything from new buildings to new bits of landscape and, of course, landscape restoration, with our key project being the restoration of the grand terraces that go from the wolf statue down to the bottom of the slope. Greenwich Park is special, if you can see behind the landmass sign, for various reasons. We have millions of visitors a year. We are part of the World Heritage Site, the Maritime Greenwich. We're a Grade 1 listed landscape. We have 3 scheduled monuments. So we have the Barrow Cemetery, the Roman Temple site, and the Flamstead House, the observatory. And we've got sort of archaeology of all periods, although we are missing a lot of prehistoric archaeology. We're not seeing it so far yet. So we're getting little glimpses, we're getting little scatters of flint work, but we're missing really substantial prehistoric sites. So hopefully within the remaining time we've got in the park, we'll hope to sort of try and develop that further and see if we can actually find some decent prehistory in the park as well. But we do have everything from Saxon barrows to Roman temples to substantial Charles II era landscape features in the park. And then a whole series of other sites, including various conduit systems, other buildings, both present and lost, and then a whole host of World War II archaeological sites as well. As Harvey was saying, the history of the park goes back as far as Duke Humphrey, and I'm going to break the taboo here and say this is Duke Humphrey here, so top left of the presentation. And he is the reason the park has survived, because he is the first one to impart the park. So he puts a wooden fence around it to enclose it. Duke Humphrey was the younger brother of Henry V, and he was at Agincourt with Henry V. And then later he imparted the park and also built a tower or a hunting lodge or folly in the park as well. We have Ignatius Sancho, who you can see hopefully below the behind the Zoom screen there. He's also our man of letters and the first Black British voter, and he lived on the edge of the park at Montague House. James I in the centre there is the first person to build the brick wall around the park in the early 1600s. Charles II, his grandson, is obviously responsible for a lot of the big landscaping projects in the park. So the park we see today is a reflection of his wealth and his money and his efforts. Well, not his efforts, his team's efforts to landscape the park. And then on the far right, you've got Henry VIII, who was often found at the palace at the bottom of the hill, which is underneath the Old Royal Naval College, the Tudor Palace of Greenwich, and it was apparently his favourite palace. And it had his tilt yard there, his jousting yard, where he had his horrific injury, which did apparently change his demeanour, because he was trapped under a horse for several hours and unconscious. So there's a lot of history in the park, both in the park and just around it. But a huge variety of figures have had an impact on the park as well, including as well Queen Caroline there, the estranged wife of George IV, who also lived on the edge of the park at Montague House. We have a few early illustrations of the site. This is pre all of Charles II's landscaping. The top one is Holler's drawing of Duke Humphrey's Tower. So this is a Tudor sort of small folly castle, and it was pulled down to build Flamstead House. So it's pulled down in these 350 years ago to before the observatory was built. And there's no trace of it above ground, but I think we're still hopeful, Jane, aren't we? There's maybe some of it left below ground. So it was a fantastic Tudor folly. It survived the Civil War, but was in a state of disrepair at the end of it. So when Charles II was looking for somewhere to build his observatory, he plonked it on top of this site and probably reused a lot of the building material inside it as well. And then below, behind the Zoom banner, is the 1558 Antonius van der Vingaard drawing of the view from the hill where the wolf statue is down to the bottom of the park and the Tudor Palace. And hopefully you can see on the screen there the towers, the jousting towers, are the Tudor jousting towers, which I'm going to there. And then you can also see, hopefully, that there are several avenues of trees in the park at this time, even before Charles II did all of his landscaping. So some of these avenues in the park were there before the sort of great changes that were made in the 1600s. You can also see some notable trees. There's this lovely tree here, which is gone now, but so at the bottom of the drawing, that must have been a key notable tree because it's got its own fence around it, presumably because you had deer in the park at this point and they were munching on all the fresh branches of the trees. Our archaeological work started though in 2021, in the autumn of 2021, when we were working with Jane to remove the tarmac path from the site. So there was a horrible, ghastly tarmac path which ran across the Barrow Cemetery. And we wanted to try and restore the Barrow Cemetery to its landscape setting. And so we removed this path to try and sort of improve the setting of the site, and also encourage visitors to sort of tread lightly across the whole site rather than channel down the middle of the Barrow Cemetery, because you don't have many Barrow cemeteries where you have a path running through the middle of them. Hopefully you can see on this image that there are a whole host of other rings there. And this is an enhanced aerial photograph from the University of Greenwich, and hopefully you can make out a whole series of rings which are the other barrows. Some of these are still surviving mounds, which you can see above ground. None of them are particularly high now. They're sort of maybe 0.5 meter max in height. But there are others there which are showing up purely as sort of parch marks, but you can't see on the ground. So we know there are probably between 40 and 50 barrows on the site, but this sort of aerial imagery suggests that there probably are additional graves there, perhaps some standard inhumations alongside the barrow mounds as well. So it's a very busy site. The site has been affected by two barrow diggers, or barrow botherers, as I like to call them, Thomas Hearn and James Douglas. Thomas Hearn we don't know much about. In the early 1700s, he comes to the park, he digs some of the mounds, and the only reference we have to him is James Douglas later, who says he was a park keeper, but there's no reference to him as a keeper. But there is a reference to a Thomas Hearn, who was an antiquarian of the Bodleian Library and was a keeper of the Bodleian Library. So perhaps those sort of terms have become muddled, and it's actually he's not a park keeper. He's the keeper of the library at Oxford. And then James Douglas comes back in the 1780s. And he's the one that really bothers a lot of the barrows over effectively a weekend. He does draw a very nice drawing, though, there of himself in the black cassock, sitting on the side of a barrow while it's pickaxed into. And hopefully you can see at the bottom that, just behind the banner again, but it says that on the following day, I opened up 12 more barrows in a day. So if you think now we might spend years digging a barrow cemetery, he dug 12 in a day, which is absolutely, I don't know quite how he managed it. It was probably 1 an hour, more than 1 an hour, depending on how long your day is. So his technique was basically to employ workmen to pickaxe into the top of each mound, dig down until they found what was left of the burial area, and then pull out anything that was in there. So we do have records of what was found in some of the mounds, but he didn't draw a site plan, unfortunately. So we have no site plan. And we only have a few drawings left. And we only have a few of the objects he found. We only know of one that has survived. But nevertheless, this drawing is a very nice drawing of his barrow bothering. And you can see in the background the deer as well, and Flamstead House. So there's it's a great picture of the park in the 1780s, even if it's a disturbing one. Of the finds, he drew a few of them. At the top there, you've got what we think is a ship's rove, a ship nail. In the middle is a spearhead, and at the bottom is a coffin nail. And then the small blobs, this is the top left photo, the small blobs around it are beads. And so these are spiral beads, very diagnostic of a particular, I think it's the 5th to 7th centuries in terms of their dating. And that spearhead is also diagnostic of the early Saxon period. Unfortunately, the spearhead hasn't survived, or at least we don't know where it is. But you can see it's so corroded that if it hadn't had immediate conservation treatment, it would have fallen apart. So we don't know. We assume that's fallen apart in a drawer over time somewhere. And the bottom there, at the bottom of the image, you've got these this bundle of hair or wool, and we think that does survive in the Ashmolean Museum. So that was probably given by Douglas to a friend of his, who then bequested some of the collection to the Ashmolean. And I haven't got to see it yet, but I have contacted the Ashmolean, and they have got that bundle of hair or wool. And it's quite an incredible survival of hair in what is a very acidic soil. So we're not quite sure how that survived. It must have been by something that which perhaps the corrosion process allowed it to be preserved. But we do have this bundle of hair or wool, and we do have just below the zoom bar a small patch of textile as well. But as far as we know, it's only the bundle of hair or wool that survives. Douglas says that none of the graves actually had bodies because they'd all disintegrated over time. And as I said, it is a very acidic soil, so it's likely that all the bones have disintegrated over time. Although I imagine the teeth would survive, but Douglas wasn't civic anything, so it wasn't done in enough detail to be able to say any more about it, unfortunately. If this wasn't bad enough for the poor Barrows, having been bothered twice in 100 years, in the 1840s, the Admiralty decided this was the perfect spot to dig a reservoir. And so they decided that right on top of the Barrows Cemetery was the ideal spot for their reservoir, and they started working away and flattening the barrows within the circle. This was very rapidly became a sort of a cause célèbre locally, and you can see in the Illustrated London News, the article on the left, that it says a set of the world's ends wretches were let loose on the barrows, and desecration took place within a few short hours. This work was stopped, but not before, anywhere between maybe 10 and 15 barrows had been flattened. And then the site was actually moved to the south, and the reservoir is still there now, the Admiralty Reservoir in the park. It's decommissioned, but it still sits as a very large, substantial feature in the park, and you can see it when you walk around the park. At the same time, the Illustrated London News also drew the barrows, and you can see that on the right-hand side. And you can even see, I think, in the top of it, Douglas's hole still. So these are the various holes again. He dug in the top of the barrows. And you can see various gentlemen and ladies in their finery promenading around the barrows. When we did our little research project on after removing the path, we didn't have any evidence for Saxon finds, but we did have a lot of Victorian rubbish. So it seems likely that people were picnicking on the barrows as well. They are also known as sort of Plum Pudding Hill. And we also know that relatively recently, exercise groups are now exercising over and around them. And so we've had to put some remedial fencing up to try and discourage that activity. So there's still a very prominent feature in the landscape, and it's still attracting exercisers and sunbathers in summer. You'd be amazed how many people sunbathe on a Saxon burial mound. The LiDAR, when you zoom in on the LiDAR, you can see that they are still surviving as a series of pimples. If I do that, yeah, so there you can see that there. In the landscape, the line running through the site is the path we've removed. But the barrows do, we think, come all the way down to Great Cross Avenue, which is this central running line through the LiDAR results, this one here. And it gets quite confused towards the bottom of the results because you can't quite tell what's a sort of a mound around a tree and what's a burial mound, because the avenues have been sort of positioned across what's left of the Barrow Cemetery. This Great Cross Avenue is one of Charles II's key avenues. He adds to the park when he starts his landscaping works in the 1660s. So it's quite possible that there are further burial mounds coming as far as Crooms Hill Gate, but it's quite hard to distinguish what's a burial mound and what's a upcast from a tree. In 2021, we also did this sample excavation of some of we sort of looked into the edges of a couple of the mounds, and what became very clear very quickly was that the mounds have been sort of built up over time, and in the images, hopefully you can see a series of turf lines, these things up here. So it looks like the mounds have been built up and then sort of more gravel added, more turf, more gravel. So perhaps they're even being tended over time. It would be nice to perhaps have another look at these at some point in the future to sort of work out exactly what's going on. But it does look like it's been a continual process of management. And then you've got this much larger gravel layer towards the top. And in some of these higher levels, we were getting a lot more Victorian material. So perhaps the Victorians have had a go at repairing and managing them over time as well. As I said, we haven't got any evidence of actual Saxon finds from the site, although we didn't dig into the centre of any of the mounds, and we didn't find anything in the areas around them. I should have said as well, we also didn't see any evidence for ditches around the mounds. It looks like they've scraped up the gravels over a burial. So they probably laid the person out in a shallow grave and then scraped the gravels up from the surrounding landscape over the body. These gravel landscapes wouldn't work with sort of very shallow ditches around them because they just collapse all the time. So I think they're probably more scoops than they are ditches. So we haven't found any evidence for Saxon activity in the small amount of trenching work we have done. We did have some prehistoric flint work, so it is possible that perhaps there is some earlier activity on the site, perhaps a prehistoric origin to some of these, to the barrows. Perhaps the barrows are there because there is a prehistoric a burial mound or some sort of prehistoric activity that they're referencing. It's also possible that perhaps the barrows are aligned along the Roman road, which is also still an unknown, it goes in an unknown direction in the park and may run across the ridge rather than go down to the bottom towards Greenwich. So again, we're not quite sure about that. We had no evidence for Roman activity, but we did find a few bits of struck flint work. And the other nice thing we had on the right is a fob watch, which had been pushed into the top of one of the burial mounds. And so it looked like a deliberate deposit, which had been actually pushed into the turf of one of the mounds, not just an occasional drop, because that would have been found. This had definitely been pushed into the top of one of the mounds. And from the look of it, and I've talked to the British Museum about this with their fob watch. They have an incredible fob watch collection at the British Museum. And it looks like it's a sort of a late 19th, early 20th century, relatively common fob watch. But it was found with a few early 20th century pennies, sort of First World War period pennies. So I'm just wondering whether this could be evidence of perhaps someone who was lost in the Great War and their watch was sort of then sort of pushed into the mound to commemorate that. It's hard to prove as a concept, but it's interesting that it was pushed into the mound alongside a couple of pennies from World War I as well. Moving on from the barrows, in 2022, we looked at the Magnetic Observatory site. So the Magnetic Observatory was a satellite site of the Royal Observatory in the centre of the park. And this was the quietest spot magnetically in the park at that time in the 1890s. And so at that time, they were trying to take magnetic readings so they could observe changes in magnetic north. And this was the best spot they could find in the park to do it because the main observatory site was far too magnetic and they were having problems there. So they did a lot of observations around the park and they picked this spot, which is just northeast of the bandstand, as the perfect site for those magnetic readings. And so for about between 20 and 30 years, magnetic observations were taken regularly from this site. After that, the whole park became too magnetic because of services and other things happening around the park. And so the Magnetic Observatory was packed up and moved to Abinger in Surrey. And a telescope site was built on the site, the Yap telescope, which is the large key-shaped structure bottom right. And a series of associated buildings were added to the site as well. And then it served as a telescope site, an adjunct to the main observatory until the 1950s when it was pulled down. This photo, the left photo is 1956, and this shows the site just before it's pulled down. You've got the large domed Yap telescope. You've got a transit circle telescope, which is this one in the half dome. And then you've got various other buildings around it, collimators. And then the building, which looks slightly oriental, slightly Japanese, is another magnetic house. And that one was apparently completely built out of asbestos. So we're not going anywhere near that because I think that would not be a very fun dig to be involved with. Top right is the original Magnetic Observatory. And we found the footings of this when we did our dig. And this building has no ironwork in it. So it's all copper nails, wooden boards, and a concrete base. There's no iron in it because it has to be neutral, non-magnetic for the readings to work. After that building goes, we then have the building bottom right, and that's the Yap telescope. And the Yap telescope was offered to the Royal Observatory by William Johnston Yap, who was a philanthropist. He offered them to buy them a new telescope, and they said they didn't have anywhere to put it. So then he built them a telescope building as well. And that was built in the 1930s. The building was pulled down in the 50s, but the telescope then went to Sussex at Hurstmonceux, and the dome went to South Africa. And I'm still trying to convince the Royal Parks to send me on a research trip to go and look at the dome in South Africa. But the police, when we were digging this, the Parks police were very sad that this building had been pulled down because they thought it would have been a perfect spot to take in the whole park from this tower structure. So our dig showed that the magnetic observatory building, which is the one top left of the image with the concrete base, survived quite well. About a third of that building survived. This is the little timber building, looks like a tea hut. But the Yap telescope had been comprehensively demolished to below ground level, and they'd ripped all of the foundations out as well and just left the service trenches in. And one small piece of concrete, which you can just see in the center of the photo, which I'll point out, this one here, which had almost been ritually left as the only piece of floor. Everything else had been nibbled out, and they just left the center of the floor behind, and all of the pipework and various high voltage cables that we weren't sure if they were live or not until we plucked up the courage to touch them, having checked out first. This was our first community dig. So the Barrows project was one just for volunteers, but this was our first community dig in the park and involved lots of volunteers. We had family days, and we also had a whole series of schools in for the first sort of school dig. So the kids all got a chance to, as a class, to dig on the site and then to wash and record the finds as well. So you can see them top right recording some of the bricks and other bits of drain from the site. And then bottom right, I will always remember these boys because they spent the whole afternoon trying to sell me finds back from the dig. So everything they found, they wanted to know how much it was worth and how much would I pay for it. And we had a very long debate over how much this stone was worth and could they sell it to me. So I will always remember them and their part in the dig. That autumn of 2022, this is all quite fast paced. We did a whole series of projects back to back. We went back to the old Keeper's Cottage. The old Keeper's Cottage was looked at by Graham Keevil in the 2010s. And some of you he may have spoken about this, but some of you may remember that dig, which took place to try and find what was the main park house in the park. Before the park opened to the public in the middle of the Victorian period, the whole park was administered from the centre of the park at the old Keeper's site here. Once the park opened to the public, all of the sort of keepers buildings were moved to the edges of the park, which is where you find our offices now. And this site was comprehensively demolished, and there's nothing left of it above ground now. But it was the main site where the whole park was administered from this central building. And then around it, you've got the Queen Elizabeth Oak that some of you might recognise, which is still a site in the park and has been dendrodated to the 1200s. And that's this one here, which is now lying down. And then a whole series of conduit structures as well. And these conduit houses are what we were interested in because Graham Keevil had found the main Keeper's Cottage, but he hadn't looked for these conduit structures. And these are part of this fantastic water system in the park, which drew water from the hillside through a series of brick-lined tunnels into these conduit chambers, and then through lead piping down to the palace and then the naval college, the naval hospital, before it was all decommissioned at the end of the Victorian period. So nothing of these conduits survive above ground, apart from the One Tree Hill conduit, which is still visible at the bottom of One Tree Hill, and the Standard House Reservoir, which sits on the other side of the park. But if you were visiting the park in the 1800s, there were sort of between 10 and 12 of these buildings actually upright in the park, which allowed you access into this conduit system, this underground world. We're currently doing a project to scan some of these conduits. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to actually show some of these laser scans and show the tunnel systems and the underground world below. And then without drawing breath, we moved rapidly on to the wilderness. So the wilderness, which is the area at the south edge of the park, was where we were going to build our new learning centre. And what we discovered from various map evidence and aerial photographs was that the location of the learning centre was slap bang where the rifle range was. And so we organised a dig to see what remained of this rifle range. At one point, all the royal parks had rifle ranges, and there were various inter-park competitions, shooting competitions. They're 2-2 ranges, so they're small bore ranges. The one at Richmond still survives. So if you want to see a Royal Parks rifle range, the setup survives at Richmond, but originally most of the parks had their own rifle ranges. And the competition continued through into the late 70s, early 1980s. But for the last 10 years, Bushy Park won it every year. And so I think after that, everyone got bored of the shooting competition and it finished. But I think Greenwich did win it one of the earlier years. So we weren't completely runners up. What we found were basically the butts end of the rifle range. So it's the sand bank, which you basically would fire into, a series of scaffolding poles, which have held the targets. And then you can also see, hopefully on the right-hand side, is one of these target pennies. So these were probably stuck to the fronts of the targets and were being shot at. And whoever shot this one was a perfect shot and actually decapitated George VI as well. So he was defaced, which I think is also treasonous, isn't it, to deface a coin? But his face was shot at by a very well-aimed 2-2 rifle marksman. So having looked at the rifle range and recorded that, we then moved on to our first collaborative project with UCL, as in the institute where we're standing today. And this project was aimed to sort of look at some of the World War II archaeology of the park. And what we found was that looking again at aerial photographs, there were some very clear indications of a very big site on One Tree Hill. You can see in the centre there, that's the Magnetic Observatory still standing in the 1945. And then just to the right of it, there's this structure here. And so we wanted to investigate what this structure was. So Chris Lockyer, who works for the Institute of Archaeology, did a magnetic mag survey for us, magnetometer survey, and basically sent me some notes saying, dig here, as in the red rectangle, and don't dig over here, as in this big line here, which is a gas main. So we had to avoid the gas main, but we did get a chance to look at the air raid shelter, which you can see very clearly here. As you can see, the shelter survives very well. It was a trench shelter, so this isn't like a large space like we're standing in now. It was a series of, a bit like being on the tube, it was a series of trenches with benches down each side of each trench. So you went in where the steps are, you can see on the image, then you sort of turned a corner, went along a side passage into another long gallery, and then for another side passage into another long gallery. So these were temporary shelters used for emergencies, and this one sat on One Tree Hill. The park had 4 shelters, so you could probably have housed about 1,000 people in the shelters in the park, but none of them were very popular because they were damp, the electricity supply was poor, they weren't well ventilated, and they weren't well loved, and there was no loo or anything. So I think most people started building their own shelters in their own backyards rather than having to run into the park to use one of these park shelters. But we do know that this one was probably used by the barrage balloon crew. Next to the air raid shelter was a barrage balloon. So there were 2 sites next to each other, and this was probably mostly used by those barrage balloonists. You can see here the preservation of the actual structure is fantastic, and there's very little wear on the steps. So again, it suggests that it wasn't used very much by people. There was not a lot of people running up and down those steps because they barely look worn at all. And then top right photograph, hopefully you can see there's a smudge. Can everyone see the smudge on the photo? That smudge, I think, is where people have been tapping out their cigarettes going into the air raid shelter. So it's one of those nice little, stories you get sometimes in archaeology where you can see people in the actual sites you're digging. So it's this smudge. It's only on that one side wall, and it's on the right-hand side as you walk down into the shelter. So I think it's where people have been tapping their cigarettes out. And then bottom right, you can see where we actually went to the full depth of the shelter to actually excavate down to get to the floor. So the sides and base of the shelter survive intact. The roof has been ripped off and the whole thing has been backfilled. So we found all sorts of things inside the shelter backfill. including a park bench, which unfortunately the people here in the audience can't quite see. It's this green one here. So they've thrown a park bench into the backfill. All sorts of RAF pottery from the nearby barrage balloon base. An echinoid, which is obviously millions of years old. James Bond was there. He left his ring behind, which he found in the backfill. And there's an APCM there, Blue Circle football badge. And then both at this shelter and the shelter that Graham Keevil dug on the Queen's Lawn, we've had a very nice lead soldier. So there's clearly some ritual activity going on where every air raid shelter you backfill in the park, you throw a lead soldier into it as part of the closing ceremony. There are still 2 other shelters we haven't touched in the park to look at as well. So the barrage balloon site, which is next to the air raid shelter, this is a lovely illustration here. The barrage balloons were often manned by the WAFs. So it was the Williams Air Auxiliary Air Force that were manning the barrage balloons. And you can see them here. They had to be tied down at all times to stop them floating away. And we did find a couple of these corkscrew pins, which would have actually been part of the system to keep them tethered down. We also know that there is at least one barrage balloon floated away in the park. And we had a lovely oral history account of somebody tying it to the railings of the park to stop it floating away. But apparently the Home Guard weren't impressed that they'd rescued it, which seems a bit unfortunate. But these barrage balloons were obviously aimed to sort of push the enemy fighters up higher into the sky so they can't come in low to attack the to attack the Port of London. And then they're a better target for the anti-aircraft batteries in the area. From the aerial photographs we've had collected in the park, we're starting to see a lot more evidence for barrage balloon sites in the park. This photograph on the left is from St Mary's Gate, and you can actually see the barrage balloon tethered on the ground there. The one in the middle bottom is from the Rangers House lawn, just near the Rangers House near Blackheath Gate. And then the one at the top is St Mary's Gate again. So these photographs are sort of showing up every time Historic England and others release more aerial photographs. I always have a look to see what else is showing up from the wartime ones. And then on the right is a photograph of the site during the war. I think it's 1940. And you can see 2 bomb craters. We've mapped all the bomb craters in the park because an account was kept of where bomb strikes were occurring. And there are sort of, I think, 60 plus bomb craters or bomb sites in the park. And you can see this one only just missed the air raid shelter. So that's the Queen's Lawn air raid shelter on the right there. And those 2 bombs only just missed it. There's another stick of bombs that went across the observatory and damaged the azimuth building as well. The next project we involved in was the Grand Ascent. So the Grand Ascent was one of Charles II's flagship projects, designed as a water cascade to bring water from the top of the hill to the bottom as part of his Baroque garden landscape. So this is a reconstruction of how the landscape might have looked if he completed all the work in the park. So you've got these planted beds, these parterre beds either side, these tree-lined beds. You then got the central fountains there and the planting there. You have what would have been a grotto behind it, and then the cascade above it. And this was Charles's vision for the park. Having spent a lot of his exile in France, he came back inspired by all the French gardens he was seeing, and he devoted a lot of time and money to developing Greenwich Park with avenues and with this grand plan to create this water cascade. The reality is he got as far as building the earthworks for the cascade and then either ran out of money, time, and also I think because of the Dutch raid on Chatham, he was a bit more cautious about staying at Greenwich, and so he moved across to Hampton Court. So in reality, we didn't get that far, but he was probably influenced by places like Ruel, which is the Cardinal Richelieu's gardens in France. And then slightly later, just to give an impression of how it might have looked, is the Chatsworth cascade, which is obviously a complete working cascade. And you can imagine our one is like Chatsworth on steroids. So it's about 3 times as wide and probably double the height of the one at Chatsworth. So the various illustrations, and these are Francis Place drawings. These were drawn in the 1670s and give an impression of how far Charles had got with the scheme. And you can see all the terraces are in place. He also apparently had worked out, talking to his garden designer in France, Le Neutre, he'd worked out how to get water, perhaps from Shooter's Hill, to the top of the park to provide water for the cascade. but then it was never topped and tailed. They never added a stone lining to it, so it was never a complete system. But the earthworks did survive over time until they were eroded away. So going back to my first image, our trench, when we did our project, we dug a trench from the top to the bottom of the hillside. And at a depth, a real depth, looking at probably 1 meter plus down, we actually came down to sort of various buried soil horizons, which are probably what's left of these terraces. But they were at depth. So you can imagine that all of the hillside is in constant movement and it actually slid down and buried what was left of these original terraces. And when we got down to this meter plus depth, we also found bits of brickwork and bits of pottery as well of the sort of late 17th century in date, which may also be associated with the building of Flamstead House. So as this is starting to erode, they're starting to build a new observatory building. And so probably bits of brickwork and rubbish are being chucked down the hillside and are settling on what's left of these steps. In addition to the actual archaeological trenching we did, we also did an extensive amount of metal detecting, both on the parterres and the grand descent, and had a fantastic collection of finds from the sort of 1600s onwards, including this lovely Royal Engineers World War II cap badge, a whole host of marbles. We are part of a telescope or sextant in the centre there. And we know that the inhabitants of the Naval Hospital would charge the public to look through their telescopes on the Grand Descent hillside. We also have various religious badges. There's a Charles V of Denmark's medallion there, fireman's cap badge, naval ones, Royal Artillery, lots of interesting clay pipes as well. So, and a whole host of interesting finds from the excavations and from the survey work. And then when we came down onto the parterres, which we also did some landscaping on to sort of crisp up those parterres, the bottom part of the Grand Descent project, we started to find, finally, we started to find some Charles II coins. So this is a Charles II farthing here. We also had an on-war service badge, snuff tin, Women's Army Corps badge, the London Fencibles, which are the Home Guard on the water, Royal Air Force badge, Greenwich Hospital buttons from the naval occupants of Greenwich Hospital, this fantastic Allies badge top right, which is a World War I badge celebrating the Allies of World War I, and obviously Japan's on it. You can't see Japan because it's below the Lammas sign, but there's Japan or one of those allies at that point. So it's a fantastic badge. And in the centre, the pièce de résistance is this Z rocket fuse. So this is from a World War II sort of one of Churchill's super weapons during World War II, which are unguided rocket batteries, which he used to fire at aircraft. And there was a battery at Shooter's Hill. So this rocket's obviously gone astray and has ended up falling in the park. And we know that at least one rocket at Shooter's Hill came straight back down onto the battery at Shooter's Hill and exploded. So they weren't very accurate and they were unguided. They were just like a mass rocket barrage. There's also a battery at Hyde Park, which you can see on the aerial photographs. So these are a couple of the images of how the Grand Descent looks now. So you can see we've re-landscaped it to create this sense of the terraces again. So the one top left is as it was last summer after we finished the works. And then bottom right is how it's looking this spring. So it's really starting to bed in nicely and give an impression of that sort of the key sort of landscape, the key landscape feature in the Charles II plan for the park. And then finally, coming on to the Romans. And at this point, I have to mention Harvey as well, because Harvey is very aware of this site. So we have a Roman temple in the site, in the park. It's under this lovely grassy mound on the right here, which you can see. The park superintendent in 1902, the park keeper, Angus Webster, was the first person to dig on the site. He found a whole series of nice finds, including this lovely roof tile with paw prints and some bits of statuary, like the statue at the bottom here, which is possibly a female goddess, possibly an archer with her arm crooked. He thought at the time he found a Roman villa. And then thanks to Harvey's work, which I'll come back to in a moment, we actually identified it as a Roman temple rather than a villa. He wasn't the only one to dig in the park at the time in the early 1900s. Herbert Jones, who was another antiquarian, was also digging in the park. And then in a classic archaeological schism, Herbert Jones and Angus Webster fell out and then dug in rival parts of the park and wrote about each other rather than wrote about the sites. So they had a real ding-dong. This dig was near the flower garden. Again, a very large area was excavated. We know that there were various Roman finds from the excavations, but we don't know, we have no site plans. We don't know exactly what Herbert Jones was up to. And the person on the right is Webster. The photograph on the left is part of the mosaic from the temple site. And this is one from one of the photos taken in 1902, which shows how close to the surface Roman archaeology was. And then the photo on the right is one from Rose Bailey from Colas, who sent me this one of Harvey's dig. I'm sure I'll have a few others, Harvey. I'm sure you've got lots of these, but this shows the dig in the 1978. Yeah, on the Temple Mound itself. The dog's in another one, I think. There is a one with the dog in. This is Becky Wallower's composite plan of all of the work that had taken place on the temple site, both what we think Webster was up to, where Harvey dug, and then also where Time Team had a look. And so this is the sort of the state of play in 1999. And then the site itself was scheduled ahead of the Olympics in 2012. So the site's now scheduled and protected nationally, which is brilliant. But we have got a fairly good idea that we have perhaps 2 phases of temple building on the site, and then some exterior buildings in the wider precinct. So in 2024, we decided to look in the landscape outside of the scheduled area, so mainly to the sort of south and southeast of the site. And we conducted a large-scale resistivity and magnetometry survey to see what was going on in the wider landscape around the temple itself. Although it was quite hard to make out what was going on in the results, hopefully you can see there's a big black blob at the top of the resistivity, and then there's a lot of what look like linears on the magnetometry. I'll just show on the thing. So the linears in here, these various enclosures, and then the black blob is the one at the top up there. And these were the ones we decided to look at in more detail with our dig in 2024. So we dug a series of trenches, working out from where we thought this central feature was on the resistivity, to try and identify features out in the wider Roman landscape. We were very lucky that we managed to avoid digging a swastika. You can see if we dug a few more side trenches, we'd have left the park with a real conundrum in terms of their reinstatement work. But luckily, it just looks like a cross shape. What we found, the park is orientated at an odd angle, so it's not orientated north-south, unfortunately. But what we found were a series of north-south running linears, so running across the site, across the middle of the site. So it looks like there's an extensive landscape of enclosures outside of the temple precinct. So we think the precinct is beyond the person kneeling in the sort of the trench at the top of the screen. There's an outer precinct ditch there, which you can still see in the landscape. And then these ditches and enclosures are outside of that. So it looks like there's quite a wealth of additional activity away from the temple, but still related to temple activities taking place. We've had a whole host of interesting finds from the Roman dig, including roof tiles, stamped Samian, Neen Valley ware. We're getting the occasional piece of flue tile as well, and we're not quite sure why we're getting flue tiles, because you shouldn't have flue tiles in a temple site, but it may indicate there are other buildings that we haven't identified yet. Getting a lot of Roman glass now, bits of amphora, bits of mortaria, hairpins, and we're getting some lead glazed ware. So bottom right is part of a lead glazed ware vessel, a Roman lead glazed ware vessel. We've also commissioned a new illustration of the Roman temple to put it in its landscape, and this is part of the new interpretation in the park. Lots of the archaeological sites around the park, including the barrows and the temple, have got interpretation boards, which is brilliant. And this one is our new interpretation of the Roman temple in the landscape, sitting on its a slight rise in the landscape with this ditch running around it. And then the 2 buildings on one side of it are the ones that Time Team identified during their dig in 1999. And then at the bottom, underneath the zoom bar, are a selection of some of the coins we've had from this dig. This one is, the one on the left is Julia Domna, wife of Septimius Severus. Then we have Elagabus, the one here, who was a teenage emperor and was bumped off for being too much of a teenager. Then you have Diocletian, the great reformer, Licinius, who's an early 4th century emperor. And then we also have a coin of Theodosius, a couple of Theodosian coins. And Sam Moorhead has been looking at the coins and the other evidence, And it looks like the activity on the site is really across all of the Roman period. So from the 1st century to the end of the 4th century. So it's a very long-lasting site. We're not sure if it's a temple for all of that time, but certainly the temple is there in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Perhaps later you still have a site that is visited and would account for the later coin losses. And then finally, how are we doing on time? Yeah, 7:20. Finally, a couple of recent finds we've had just from our finds processing we're doing at the moment. And we've run a couple of pottery workshops with Edward Biddulph from Oxford Archaeology. And we now identified at least 3 pieces of tazza, which are these incense burner sherds. So it looks like we're getting incense burners, which are being broken up and then thrown into ditches. We're getting a lot of Highgate wood pottery, which is the one on the right-hand side. And you've got that nice illustration of the one from the London Archaeologist. And then bottom right, you've got this piece of graffiti on a sherd as well. So on a piece of Samian, someone scrawled their name or their initials so that they don't lose it during one of the festival activities. So thank you very much for listening. This illustration, I like to have this one at the end because this one sort of draws together a lot of the things I spoke about during the talk. This is an illustration from, I think it's 1680. And it shows the grand ascent on the left-hand side, starting to wear away because they didn't complete it. The newly built observatory on the top of the hill there, sitting where Duke Humphrey's Tower was. The newly planted tree avenues and parterres. The completed Queen's House at the bottom, and then the remains of the Tudor Palace on the right, next to the new Stuart Palace being built in the sort of centre right of the image. And then in the background, you have the smouldering remains of London 10 years after the Great Fire as well. So I'll pause there. One last thing to say is we have had some additional funding this year, so we'll be doing an additional dig in May, probably looking at the Roman landscape again. So if Lamas as a group would like to come along in May and actually visit the site, we'll be there from, I think, the 2nd week of May to the end of the month, doing another project in the park. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for listening at home as well. Right.
Right. Put the lights up.
Clapping.
Also clapping. Right. If anyone at home has questions, please can you type them into the chat?
And if they've got questions from here,
If they have questions from here.
please ask Andrew.
Yes.
So where is the Roman road?
Oh, that's a really good question. Stuart Ainsworth from Time Team thinks he identified a visible feature on LiDAR coming into the park. But looking at it again, I think it's probably part of an earlier park boundary. We did put a trench across part of it, and there was nothing Roman in it at all. So it must come near the temple, but it doesn't come on the east side because that's where we were digging and there was no evidence there. It was just all enclosures. So it must either snake around those enclosures or perhaps come around the other side. There's a very substantial valley on the other side of the temple, almost like a hollow way going straight down the hillside. So it's even possible it aims down there. Or does it come straight through the park and where the Saxon Barrows are on the other side? Does it actually come on the top of the ridge? We're not sure. The big problem is it's probably a gravel road in a gravel landscape. So it's quite hard to know that you found it.
If I could I just
Yes, I'll go for it.
I think I mean major Roman highways like that ought to be relatively easy to identify. So I think when you find it, you will know pretty well what it is.
Yeah.
But of course we're in difficult sort of topographic terrain, aren't we? I mean, a major Roman road is approaching London, but it's got to navigate these deep hills.
Yeah.
It's got to find its way across the low ground further towards London before it actually gets there. So the fact it's difficult to find doesn't surprise me in any way at all. It doesn't have to be too near to the temple either, because you could have, I mean, the temple could have, well, it's your night, not mine.
No, you go for it.
All I was going to say was, I have suggested elsewhere that there may be a military relationship with that temple and with that hill and with crossing the river. one of the finds from the time team did, of course, was a procuratorial tile. So it looks like the Roman procurator was responsible for some of that building,
Yeah.
perhaps its reconstruction, much as he was responsible, or they were responsible, for a lot of the buildings in London and Southwark.
Yeah.
So it could be an official activity there. What you found, of course, by the more recent work is how big that complex might be, and how difficult it might actually be to interpret until the whole area is cleared, and perhaps the buildings that might have related to people who are living there are actually found.
Yeah.
But
what Edward Biddulph said when he looked at the pottery during our pottery workshop was he thought there was a definite domestic slant to it. So it's not just an assemblage from a temple. So there is definitely domestic activity happening there. So there are people living on the site as well as all the official temple activity taking place, all the drinking cups and the incense burners. So there's both going on, but obviously where they're living is still something we need to tease out a bit more.
No, I think it's a very important spot, and it's great that you've done all this community work on all these sites of all these periods. I think you've put the Greenwich Park on the map. Sorry, I shouldn't. Please, other questions for Andy, either from here or from coming in.
There's a couple of
Oh yeah.
All right.
So are there any publications we can read for more information on recent archaeology?
So there's lots of web articles at the moment, and obviously we're now drawing together all the information at the moment. So you can see a sort of slightly longer articles about the various sites on the Greenwich Park website.
How much of the park was given over to allotments?
I
spotted that in one of
the whole of the lower part of the park was all allotments. During World War I and World War II, we have no aerial photos from World War I to show the extent of it. But for World War II, all of those lower lawns were allotments. And there was a real battle over how the reinstatement afterwards, because the allotment holders wanted to keep the allotments. And I think they were there till the end of the 40s before it was all reinstated. So there will be a lot of archaeology there of allotments on those lower fields.
I think I know the answer, but no nice plan of all the archaeological sites around that.
I don't know, but I could find out. I mean, I worked with Guy Taylor, who's done a lot of work with me on the sort of the sites in the park. Guy might know more, mightn't he? Jane, do you think Guy's a good? Yeah.
And you mentioned the Shooters Hill activity.
There's lots of activity on Shooters Hill. There are at least 3 barrage sites in the park, and obviously they would have been. That's just one small element of a much larger landscape. Okay, I think there's one in Hyde Park. There's most of the parks would have had them as well, I think.
Well, a lot of artillery based on Shooters Hill, wasn't there? Because they're facing the V1s coming in as well as the earlier raids. And again, it's interesting because Shooters Hill has that magnificent high point, and then everything then declines down on both ways. And it's again a bit like the declining areas the areas going down from the top of Greenwich Park. So there are similarities there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And there was a big anti-aircraft battery on Blackheath as well. So
any more questions in the room? No more at home? I think that's all.
No. Well, I just before saying thank you, and I think one thing you have highlighted tonight is the amount of work that we really ought to be doing in a lot of parts of the country over World War II sites. You've highlighted a few here. It's just we realise we're a long way away from World War II now. Most of the people who lived through it are no longer with us. And I think finding this, discovering the places where they had shelters, the sort of activity that you find in them, I think it is a very important aspect of it, and we ought to be thinking about that a lot more right over the country before that dreadful period is actually lost to us.
I mean, the other nice thing, obviously, with Greenwich and I think Greenwich in particular, you've got that great survival of World War II archaeology as well, because obviously a lot of those sites are regularly removed, aren't they, even today, if they're not protected? So
Yes,
we're lucky to have these time capsules in the park.
absolutely,
Um,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, unless there are more questions, what I'd just like to say, I'm sure on behalf of us all, it was a very good talk. It demonstrates, I mean, apart from the park itself, which of course is such a pleasant area and such a great survivor, it is just so important to be able to use it to undertake community archaeology
Yeah.
projects, to really introduce us, a lot of young people I saw
Yep.
there. It's important to be able to spread that to people of all ages, people of all social classes, if I
Yeah.
can still use that term. And what you're doing there is very, very significant, and I hope it will be not only continued, but a model for work that can go on
I think
in other parts of the country.
we're lucky that we work with the Field Studies Council, so they've been
Mm.
really great at bringing the schools in.
Mm,
But then equally, we've worked with, young archaeology clubs as well.
yes,
And then we've got a really nice diverse range
Yeah.
of volunteers of all ages and abilities. So
yes,
it's been
yes,
great. Yeah.
yes. I like the
And
story about
UCL.
the guys who wanted to to sell you their fights.
Yeah, those kids. Yeah,
They
they were
started young.
Yes, they did.
And I hope you're going to send that picture of that First World War sign of all the Allies with the Americans and the British on it. I hope you're going to send a picture of that to President Trump. Anyway, slightly more seriously, Andy, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful talk. We're all very grateful here. I'm sure those who've seen it from home are very grateful too. So
Thank you, Harvey.
good, and good luck with her
Thank
as
you.
you carry on.
Yeah, and do come visit in the summer as
Yeah,
well.
that would
Yeah.
be lovely. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yes,
Okay,
that would be good. Yeah.
great. Okay, super.
All right. Well, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay.
I said, that's not clapping. We'll clap.
That was brilliant.
Yeah.
That was really nice.
Excellent.
Good to see it.
Yeah,
again. So,
yeah.
actually, I hadn't seen one of those pictures of the temple with one of the mosaics, or get a copy of that.
They're from that scrap. Did I tell you about that
That
scrapbook we
scrapbook,
found? Yeah,
yes.
the legend. Yeah.
Amazing how, I don't know what you call it, Charles's landscape or Lenotta's landscape, but how those trees, avenues.
Ta-ra,
still
folks.
dominate.
See you next time. See you at the conference on Saturday.
Quite amazing.
There's one particular